So I guess we can begin. I'm Stan Kraventsov, and this is Mahmoud Abdel Rasul. Introductions, do we need to tell about ourselves? Or?
Yeah.
Well,
you don't have to. But.
Okay. I have a PhD in electrical engineering and a master's degree in AI, and I've spent about 10 years playing poker for a living, and now I'm getting back into machine learning, looking for jobs in machine learning. And Mahmoud, do you want to say anything?
I am Mahmoud. I am a software developer. I'm interested in data science. I work at Mojo. It's a company based here in Vancouver, and we are hiring.
What does the company do? What do you do?
We work on a platform for connected cars. It has been a very fast-growing company. Now we have offices with engineering here and in Palo Alto, in the Silicon Valley, and we're hiring in both locations. And the company is hiring both for data science and for software engineering.
Right, so the title of today's presentation is 2018 Data Science Bowl Kaggle Competition, Find the Nuclei in Divergent Medical Images to Advance Medical Discovery. And we worked together on this competition. There were actually a couple other people who started it with us, but they sort of dropped out because it's a lot of work working on those competitions, actually. And we started late with, it was a 3-month competition, and we started 2 months in, so we only had 1 month to work on it. So we're really rushing to finish our training, and I would like to give a big thank you to Matt for letting us use his GPU during the last week so that we could finish training our models. Thank you, Matt. And okay, so let me see, how do I? I guess I can go full screen. Yeah, that makes sense. So the Data Science Bowl is an annual competition since 2015, and they've been working on different problems here, mostly medical problems in the last few years. And as you can see, it's becoming more popular. It started with 1,000 team, like in 2017 it was 2,000, and 3,600 teams this year. And for this 2018 competition, the problem statement was to create a computer model that can identify the position and shape of cell nuclei in various medical images. This is a direct statement from the Kaggle page. And identifying nuclei apparently allows researchers to identify each individual cell in a sample. And by measuring how cells react to various treatments, the researcher can understand the underlying biological processes. And the important thing about this statement is that to identify each individual cell, because this is important, you don't just need to say that this is a bunch of cells, all of this part of the image is cells, but you have to actually identify each one, and I'll talk more about that. But first, I'll tell you about the competition format. It was a bit unusual. It's a 2-stage competition. Most Kaggle competitions are 1 stage when you just have 1 deadline. But here we had 2 stages. The first stage was from January 16th to April 11th. And then at the end of the first stage, we were supposed to have a model that was all ready to go, so we were not allowed to change any model parameters in the second stage, although we could retrain on the training plus test data because the labels for the test data became available at the end of stage 1. And this was actually, there was a big controversy about this competition because they didn't clearly specify that people needed to submit models at the end of stage 1, so a lot of people didn't submit any models. And then at the end of stage 2, they sort of just removed all of those people from the leaderboard, and there were a lot of complaints. And so basically we ended the competition as it was in 72nd place, I think, or something like that. And then 3 days later, we discovered that we're in 42nd place. And because they just removed a bunch of people, and then we're slowly crawling back down now because people are complaining and they're adding them back in. So now I think we're in 60th place, but in any case, it's top 2%, so it's pretty good.
But they reversed the rule eventually. They reversed the rule. They reinstated the teams that did not submit a model.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Yeah, they're reinstating those teams, which sort of is not good for our rankings, but I mean, we're still doing okay. The input data was 669 images for the training set of stage 1, mostly grayscale, about like maybe 5/6 is grayscale and like 1/6 was in color. And each image in the training set came with a set of ground truth masks, which were hand labeled. So I guess they spent a lot of work like hand labeling those 669 images. And for the stage 1 test set, it was 65 images with about the same proportion of grayscale and color. And for the stage 2 test set, it was 3,000 images, but most of them were just sort of dummy images. They definitely didn't hand label all of those. It was just done with the purpose so that the participants don't hand label the images themselves. So the actual set for the leaderboard, I think, was something like 100 images or something like that, and the rest was just there so that to make it more difficult for people to go around like creating a good machine learning model. And the format of submission file was run length encoding. And the competition metric was a little bit complicated. So essentially it was based on intersection over union. And I have those pictures here showing the intersection and the union. So basically, the closer the predicted nucleus is to the actual nucleus, obviously the more the intersection, and the union always, so basically if there is an ideal match, then the ratio of intersection to union is 1, which is what you want. And basically the positives were determined when the intersection over union is over a certain threshold, T, where T was varied between 0.5 and 0.95. Did you have a question?
On the last slide, you said the submission format. What I'm not familiar.
Run length encoding basically is just a way to. I know you work with like JPEGs and PDFs and like trying to figure out different encodings. Run length encoding is very simple. You're just saying like it's 1 for 10 instead of like if it's like 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 0 0 0 0. Instead, you're saying 1 10 times and 0 5 times.
Oh, okay.
So it saves space for the file.
I have a question on your next slide.
All right.
I'm a little confused about the thresholds. Was there a fixed set of thresholds and they calculated this precision for each of them? Or?
Yes, we calculated this precision for each of them, and then we took the average over all thresholds.
Average over there. Oh, that says it right there. Good. Okay.
Yes. Yes. So basically, it was sort of complicated to like figure out exactly how to calculate that, but I mean, I guess we managed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you have sample image?
Yes, in a couple of slides we'll get to those images, yes. Intersection over union is important in the sense that you actually have to determine, like, let's say if there are two nuclei and you predict them as 1, then this metric is not going to give you a good score because the intersection over union, either with one of them or the other one, will actually be smaller than 0.5 because each nucleus that you predict can only relate to one ground truth nucleus when you have the threshold of 0.5. So you actually have to separate those overlapping nuclei. That's what this metric was used for. So how do you approach a problem like that? So basically, you need to understand what type of a problem it is, and there are different problems that you deal with when you have images. And there is detection, so basically you just need to understand whether there is something present in the image or not. Like here it's the third slide, like object detection, like you're saying there is a cat and a dog and a duck there. And there is classification. You need to determine which class it belongs to. And then there is localization, meaning that usually you need to find the bounding box for your object. And what we needed here in this problem is instance segmentation, where you need to find the exact shape for each object, which is a lot more difficult. And when we get to the section about theory, I'll talk more about that. But for now, I'll hand it over to Mahmoud, and he'll talk about our solution first.
So before I start talking about the solution, let me try to give you a sense of... So before I start talking about the solution, let me try to give you a sense of how the problem looks like. So these are some of the images that we got in stage 1. And as you can immediately see, images can come in a variety of colors, and nuclei can have a variety of shapes. For those of you who don't have a background in biology, you may be asking, where are the nuclei? So let me go through some of these images. So this is one nucleus. And as you can see in this image, some nuclei can overlap or can touch each other in the image. And part of the task that we're expected to do in this competition is to separate nuclei that are overlapping or touching and return an individual mask for each one of them. This is a nucleus. This is a nucleus. The nucleus here is the very dark area, the very small dark area, not the large gray area surrounding it. This is a nucleus. See, in this image, this is an image with literally hundreds of nuclei. These small spots are a nucleus each. These are nuclei, the purple areas, the very dark purple areas. Everything else that's not very dark purple is not a nucleus, so we need to separate these out of this image.
Excuse me, can you point at the screen instead of the monitor?
Can
Pointing
I?
at the monitor, it's pointing at the screen.
There is a circle surrounding the nucleus.
No. But you're pointing at the monitor, which we cannot see where you're pointing.
Sure. So. So these are nuclei, what are surrounded by circles here. There are also, so if you think from the example so far that you can separate nuclei out by color, well, that's also not enough, because sometimes you'll have debris in an image that's of the same color as nuclei. As I mentioned earlier, some of the nuclei can be overlapping. So here are some examples, and we will, part of the task is to separate these overlapping nuclei. So if you think about this problem, you can, here are two ways to address this problem. You can think of the problem as object identification, or you can think of the problem as an image segmentation problem. And the way we thought of the problem was image segmentation. If you think of the problem this way, you immediately notice that there are two different kinds of borders that an algorithm needs to be able to detect. One of them is the border between the nucleus and the background, and the other is the border between the nucleus and an adjacent nucleus or an overlapping nucleus. The second one is probably the more difficult one to detect, because the difference in color will be less obvious. So to address this as a segmentation problem, the most suitable neural network architecture is the unit architecture. This was published only a few years ago. And I don't want to go into the details now. Of the architecture now. We're going to go through these details later in the presentation. But what you need to know now is that the input to the unit is a tensor of dimension 3 by 256 by 256. This represents the image. And the 3 is because the image will have 3 color channels. The output is 1 by 256 by 256. So think of this as something that takes as input an image, a colored image and outputs something like a grayscale image. The loss function that we use is a binary cross entropy loss function, which allows us to interpret the output not as a color, but as a probability. And this helped us in the heavy post-processing that we needed to do in this competition. So,
sorry, can you just go back to the slide before this? I think you might talk about this later, but the data set that you were given from Kaggle, were those nuclei, the coordinates of what is a nuclei, were they pre-identified or were you guys labeling the images yourself?
The training set, in the training set, will have the image and a set of masks, a set of images, one for each nucleus, showing the exact
coordinates,
not just coordinates,
sure,
but where the a mask that covers the area that the nucleus covers.
So what the area that encompasses, essentially, you'll have the coordinates
Yes.
of the area that encompasses that nucleus. So it would be segmented for you before you go and do it.
Segmented,
Okay.
and it's not just coordinates. We actually we get as training data masks, and we're expected in our predictions to produce masks.
Okay.
So if the output is a single image that is 256 by 256, how can we use a network like this to do segmentation? So the idea is that you take all the masks that are, so during training, you take all the masks that are the expected output of a given image, and you OR all the masks together, and you end up with a combined mask, the mask on the right. And we train the network so that when it takes the image on the left as an input, it tries to predict the image on the right. And we train this on the data with the training data that was given to us with some augmentation, and we tried to tune the parameters of the network to improve the score. And after quite a bit of work, we ended up with a network that it gave us a score that was not in the top 30% in the competition. So, but we thought we got a good neural network to start our solution from. The rest of the work for the competition, we ended up in the top 2%. The difference is processing the input to help the network learn better, and post-processing the output to try to interpret the output of the network in a way that is better, that makes the predictions better. One thing that you will immediately notice here is that once I combine the masks, nuclei that are adjacent to each other now became fused, and therefore the network.
Yeah, sorry. Could you show like examples of, or maybe it will be later, examples of what you get as your predictions?
Sure, yes.
Images, right?
This is in the upcoming slides.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
What you see here is that the masks became fused, and many of the competitors tried to address this problem by taking this combined mask and running some image processing algorithms on it. However, what this means is that you use the neural network, let it solve the easy part of the problem for you, and you're still left with the difficult part of the problem to solve, which is separating nuclei that are overlapping or touching. So the way we address this is before we combine the masks, we peeled one pixel from around each mask. So if you peel one pixel, this is how these two masks look like. And therefore, no masks will touch each other in the combined mask, but this also means that there will be a post-processing step where we will need to pad each mask by one pixel. How effective is this? Here is an example. This is an image. The one on the left is an image, and the picture that is in red is the probabilities that were output by the network for this image. What you can see here, so more red means higher probability that the pixel belongs to a mask. And what you can see here, these are two nuclei that are touching. in the output probabilities, it looks like the network was able to separate the nuclei. It looks like we have two distinct areas of very high probability. So how will we process this image to separate the nuclei? One easy way that we can think of is to use a constant threshold, probability equals 0.5. So anything higher than 0.5 is part of a mask, anything lower is not. The problem with this is that you can still, so the area between these two predicted nuclei had probability of a little higher than 0.5, and therefore the nuclei still were not separated. But then it looks like the network gave us some good output that we can start from. We just need better post-processing. So to do this post-processing, we started from, one thing you can notice here is that each nucleus has a core that has very high, that appears to have very high probability, and then there is a halo around it that has a probability that is not as high. So maybe if we increase the threshold to say 0.8, we can end up with a number of seeds for these nuclei, and these seeds, and then we can, now that we have separated the nuclei, we can expand these seeds up to the boundary where the probability reaches 0.5. If we do that, we can do that using an algorithm called the Watershed Algorithm, and the result becomes like this image. And as you can see, we have successfully separated nuclei. We have successfully separated these nuclei. We successfully separated some more nuclei here. How important is this? How important was this for our score? This, so let's go over the scoring metric in a little more carefully. You can see that if your intersection over union for any nucleus is below 0.5, you get 0 score for this nucleus. It's as if you never found a nucleus at all. So imagine if you have two touching nuclei that are approximately the same size, and you predict a mask that covers both nuclei. The intersection over union for each of the nuclei will be about 0.5, and therefore you'll get 0 score for both nuclei. So it's as if the prediction was useless. Actually, it's a little worse than useless, because after that they have a step where they calculate what they call the precision, and as you can see in the formula, the denominator has the false positives as part of it. So the more false positives that you have, the worse your score is, and this so you would have been better off not predicting that mask at all than predicting the mask. This applies not only to masks that span multiple nuclei. See, for example, this image. This image was actually a very dark image. I actually had to brighten it so that you can see it here. The neural network was able to predict probabilities fairly well for this image, at least for part of the nuclei. But then we have this fragmented nucleus that was not predicted very well, and it left us with so many fragments. What happens if you run the Watershed algorithm on this? You end up with 3 very good predictions. Here is one, here is another one, here is a third one, but then you end up with a lot of false positives. If we ignore the false positives, our score for this image would have been about close to 0.75, 3 out of 4. You add the false positives to that, and the score becomes about 0.18. So it's very bad. So we looked for multiple ways to eliminate false positives. The way we ended up with is to, we looked at how did the Watershed algorithm work. If the size of the area, of the final area of the nucleus is more than twice the size of the seed, we assumed that this prediction is a very uncertain prediction, and therefore we eliminated the prediction completely. So the result of this became like this. There are still some false positives, but this image will get a little less than 0.5, which is a lot better than 0.18. these were the most important, these probably were the key ideas in the solution. There are other ideas that were also important. As you know, as I already explained, the input of the network has dimensions of 256 by 256, but the images that were given don't have the same dimension. You have one of two options. You can resize the image so that it fits inside this 256 by 256, or you can cut the image. All images that were given, or the vast majority, were larger than 256 by 256. So you can cut the image, slice the image to sizes that can fit into the input of the network, and then stitch the results back together. As you can see here, cutting the image and stitching back the results gave us a much better prediction, which is the image on the right. We also did some normalization. Actually, the only normalization we did was to invert the images that have a light background. The effect of this is that you end up with a smaller dynamic range of your input, which helps your network learn better. And we also did data augmentation. We did quite a bit of data augmentation, but I believe there was opportunity to do even more. We did mirroring around both axes and around the corner. We did cropping. So we always kept the original resolution of the image, because we talked about peeling and padding 1 pixel. If you resize the image, the 1 pixel does not become 1 pixel anymore. So we always kept the original resolution. We sharpened and blurred the image. We added noise to the image. And we also shifted the colors in some color channels. And there is no Kaggle presentation that's complete without some mention of ensembling. We actually called our team Vancouver Ensemble. We ensembled, in our final solution, we ensembled 21 models. The motivation behind that is that we did not have a reliable criterion to know which epoch to stop at, which model is the best model. And we noticed that even after hundreds of epochs of training, the one epoch can have a somewhat substantially different result from the next. Not huge, but enough to make a difference in the rankings. So what we did, we noticed that the network appeared to stabilize after 200 epochs or so. So we took all the models. We took the models at epoch 200, 205, 210, all the way to 300. That adds up to 21 models. We did the predictions through each of these models. We averaged the predictions from all the models, and the score was slightly higher than the score of the models that we tried individually from this set. So it looked like this improved our score a little, but more importantly, it gave us a reliable way to know which model to pick. In stage 2,
I just have a question about the struggles of not being able to know how well your model is doing as it's training. Can you kind of go into that? Why was it hard to evaluate as you're training?
So if we go back to these images, you see a lot of variation in these images. But we had a lot less of some of these images in the training data than others. The training data, the vast majority of the training data was white on black, the images that are white on black like this. We had very few images like this one at the bottom, the colored image at the bottom. I think we only had 4 in all of the training set. So we had one of 2 options. We could try to create a validation set that takes away from the very few images that we had, or we can try, actually we had multiple options, we could do that, or we can create a validation set that does not take away from this scarce training data, but becomes not very representative of the data. Or we can do the ensembling the way I described. Our final solutions in this competition, you're allowed to have 2 final solutions, not only one. So one of them used the validation data to know which model to try to pick the models. The other one used the ensembling idea. And the one that used ensembling scored better.
Hi. Yeah, my question is, have you thought of maybe reversing the dark images and then sort of making these colored images just black and white so that you have a sort of consistency in your data set? So you reverse all of these ones so that they are consistent, and then you decolor the...
If you decolor images, you're losing information. You're better off starting with colored images, training with colored images rather than black
So
and white.
were the majority of the images color, or?
Actually, the majority were grayscale.
Okay.
Yeah, but we actually tried converting the colored images to grayscale and like treating them uniformly, and the accuracy was actually worse than predicting on them separate, like having colored images in addition to black and white.
Yes, questions?
Okay, I have 3 questions. Do you have this code available online somewhere? Or is it secret source or open source?
Not right now. We can discuss that. We can discuss using it.
Yeah, then the second one I wanted to add, you said you have lower dynamic range. So in that case, what's it called? A racial image won't be an issue because you actually have even just 2 dynamic range, most likely. Not so much. Your dynamic range is low in a racial image, isn't it?
The dynamic range is what?
You said lower dynamic range helped you to learn better. Is that what you said?
It helps training, yes.
Yeah, so if it helped you, then racial image would have also helped you as well, because racial image has usually it could have like lower dynamic range because it's the number of pixels mostly empty, is it?
What I meant is the images become more similar. And therefore the network needs to deal with less variation between the images.
Okay. So then I have one last question about this watershed algorithm.
Watershed, yes?
Yeah, can you explain like more?
We are going to explain it later in the slides.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
May I ask another question? Have you used pre-trained neural network, right? UNet.
We used UNet. What?
Yeah. Was it pre-trained on?
It was not pre-trained. We trained it.
It was not. Have you tried? So when you try to do everything grayscale, have you still used free layers, free channels as input, or you used one channel as input?
The input was always 3 channels, even for
always
grayscale
3
images.
channels. Yeah, that actually. So yeah, that's why in my experience, then you have 3 same inputs in your model, right? Your model kind of uncertain. It can take first part from this channel, second part from this channel, or it can take second part from first channel and first part from second channel. So if you do grayscale, you have to you don't have to use 3 same channels as input. It would definitely will decrease your. So probably that's why if it's easier to use colors, because you just don't have to deal with another architecture actually. Yes. Yes, there is correlation. Yeah, basically there is a perfect correlations between these 3 channels. Yeah, right. You're right. And that sucks.
There's another question there.
For the data question, for the masks that you're given, are they overlapping at all? Like, is it ever in your, do you ever want to classify a pixel as belonging to 2 different nuclei?
That's a great question. No, they don't overlap, which means that if you have 2 nuclei that are overlapping, one of them will have its full mask maybe, and the other one will have a mask that is partial. There was no specific rule regarding which one is predicted with the full mask and which one is not. So we had to use the training data, I guess, to predict that.
Simple question. Did you keep the images in a RGB color space, or did you map them to something else?
RGB.
I'm wondering if you can give the UNet, this pixel is part of the nucleus, and have the UNet kind of expand that. Does that make sense? So you'd have your color channels, then you'd have like a fourth channel, which would just give you one pixel inside the nucleus, and then to tell it where to start, which nucleus to focus on, and then have it predict that one nucleus.
So what you're thinking of is running some image processing algorithm first to suggest starting points for the prediction?
Yeah, which could be your first UNet. And then you have a second UNet that tries to, given the starting point, it tries to predict a single mask.
This sounds like an interesting idea. I don't think I have seen any teams try this idea.
Okay. Cool.
So we discussed data augmentation and we discussed ensembling, and then came stage 2. The types of images that we encountered at stage 2 were very different. Some of them were similar to stage 1, but some of them were very different. And part of the challenge of this competition, and we were, everybody was warned on the forums by the organizer of the competition, is that stage 2 is going to have substantially, can have substantially different images. Our solution was proved to be robust and scored well after these changes. We don't know which ones of these images or these patterns were used in scoring, though. So we're still waiting for an announcement if they are going to announce that. There are some things that we wish we did. The list is longer than that, but some of the important things, I think we could have done more data augmentation, including resizing. I mentioned that if you resize one pixel, it does not become one pixel anymore, but we could have come up with a solution for that. We could have swapped color channels, swapped green and blue, for example, and this adds to our data. We could have done more sharpening of the images, more normalization, and we could also adjust the learning rate, even if it didn't help the network reach better predictions. It may have helped speed up the training and maybe would have allowed us to experiment with more ideas. So now that I gave you an idea about the solution, Stan will go into more details about the theory underlying the solution, and also will go through some of the solutions that were attempted by other teams, by winning teams.
Right, thank you, Mahmoud. So yeah, let me delve into this theory. So basically, there are several existing approaches to instance segmentation. And the first thing that we tried when we just were looking at the data, we tried the standard computer vision techniques that were not related to neural networks, and we didn't get good accuracy. The best we got was something like 27%, which was not good at all. And in case of instance segmentation, not just classification, standard CNNs, like those trained on the ImageNet, like very good CNNs, but not specifically for instance segmentation, they usually don't produce very good results. So usually you use special architectures of CNNs to handle this problem. And the two most common ones used in this competition and in general are the UNet, the one that we used, and the other one is the MaskR CNN, and I'll tell you a little bit about both of those architectures. There is also a third class that is used by people, single-shot detectors and YOLO, but that class, it's not very good for Kaggle competitions because the main advantage of that class is that it's pretty fast, but usually it's not as accurate. So if you're doing, if it's not some sort of a kernel competition where you have to finish within 1 hour or something like that, you probably don't want to use those.
I don't have a question, but I'm hearing like some high-pitched.
Getting a little feedback.
Are we standing too close to each other, maybe? Oh yeah, if you turn yours off, maybe. All right, yeah, thank you, man. So this is like a general convolutional neural network. It has some convolutional layers and pooling layers and some fully connected layers at the end. And then it gives you output prediction in case of classification. But because of those pooling layers, you need to have those pooling layers there because otherwise your model will be too complex if you don't reduce the size of the image. And it will be difficult to prevent overfitting. But if you have those pooling layers, you really reduce the resolution of your image. So then if you try to do the image segmentation on that, usually it tends not to give you very good results because with much smaller resolution, obviously, you can't get all of the pixels right. So the UNet, the model that we used, is a convolutional neural network which was originally created for fast and precise segmentation of biomedical images. So when people started this competition, I guess they all Googled like biomedical images, CNN, and they got this UNet. So a lot of people actually used it. And it's easier to train than the other model that people use, the MassCar CNN, because this is just one network as opposed to MassCar CNN, which is essentially like two networks combined together. And here is the basic structure of the UNet. It looks like the letter U. So basically on the left part is the encoder, which is just a standard fully convolutional network without any dense layers, which gives you your features. And then what you do in order to do instant segmentation, well, image segmentation will be better here. Actually, semantic segmentation would be like the most precise term here, and I'll explain why. And then you do a sort of symmetric right part, which goes back to the original resolution, and you have those skip connections that join there from the left part, which allows you to get the idea of the original structure. So this turns out to work really well for this kind of problem, like predicting all of the pixels that belong to a certain class. But since it produces a segmentation probabilities map as an output, and Mahmoud showed you examples of those probability maps, additional processing is required to separate instances. So it's not, as I said, it's semantic segmentation. It just predicts you all of the pixels that belong to a certain class, like Nucleus here, for example, but you still need to separate them. So it's not an instant segmentation network. So this additional processing is that we used, and a lot of other teams, I think, used it too, those who used the UNet, is the Watershed Algorithm, which is a classic image segmentation method from 1977. Basically, it's based on a landscape slowly flooded by water. And the idea is that you choose the points of either highest or lowest value, depending on what kind of a problem you're looking at, to start your basins. In our case, since it was probabilities, we chose the highest values. And then you slowly lower the threshold to include more points. And when two of those catchment basins meet, you keep them separate by remembering the boundary where they met. Those points where they met, you remember them as the boundary, and you still keep those two separate. And to make sure you don't go all the way to zero in probability, because then you'll include a lot of background points, so you use some sort of a threshold to separate the objects from the background. So that's the basic idea of the Watershed algorithm. It's actually not very complicated, but we didn't have to program it. It's all part of one of the Python libraries, maybe scikit-learn or something. Yeah, I don't remember exactly what we used, but one of those. Or I think it was maybe OpenCV, I'm not sure. So the other architecture that people used in this competition is this one, MassCar CNN, which is based on faster RCNN. The faster RCNN was developed in 2016 based on some previous RCNN models, but this one is much faster, as you can tell. And it has basically, it's a much more complex model. It usually uses some networks such as ResNet, those networks that work really well on ImageNet, but it also has this region proposal network. So basically, you train another convolutional neural network there that gives you the regions where, in its opinion, there could be an object such as Nucleus, in this case. So basically, and then you go over all of those regions, and this main neural network, main convolutional network that you have, such as a ResNet or a DenseNet, predicts on particularly those parts of the image. And it tells you whether, like, it gives you, basically it has three outputs, one for classification, one for the bounding box, and one for the mask. So mask RCNN, the difference between faster and mask RCNN is that the mask RCNN has this third output channel for the mask. So since it has this segmentation, it doesn't usually require additional processing for instance separation. And actually, like, let's say the third place solution basically was very simple. They just trained the RCNN that they had really well, and they basically did nothing else. So, but I'll get to that. So are there any questions about the theory? Yes?
So for your implementation of the watershed algorithm, so for your implementation of the watershed algorithm, you said you use a threshold. Is that constant for every image, or do you change it between color or grayscale with each image?
We definitely used it the same for each image, like within the certain category. Between our two models, I think one model had it constant for both grayscale and color. And we found out experimentally that a value of something like 0.45 or 0.46, something like that, worked best. And for the other one, we actually separated it to like 0.42 for maybe color, then 0.46 for grayscale, because that seemed to work better separately. So,
would that introduce problems when you get a variety of images in stage 2, or like, do you think that's a
well, potentially. I mean, essentially, those thresholds didn't matter like a huge deal.
Okay.
They basically changed the accuracy a little bit, and it seemed to be somewhat random. Like sometimes you change the threshold a little bit and it gives you better accuracy, and you keep going in the same direction and it gives you worse accuracy, and then you go in the same direction and it gives you better accuracy again. So so we didn't spend a huge amount of time trying to pinpoint the exact value, because we thought it was pretty random, and we didn't know if the stage 2 images would be different from stage 1. So.
And then can I ask where in stage 2, like where do you think you lost points, or what kind of images lost you points?
In stage 2, what kind of images lost us points? It's hard to tell because there are 3,000 images there, and we don't know which ones actually belong to the set that they based the leaderboard on. So, and they never, as far as I know, they still haven't released the answers. Yeah. So yeah, it's hard to tell in stage 2. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll proceed to the top solutions then. Here is the final leaderboard. So the first place had a score of 0.631. This was like a nice competition in the way that I don't really like those competitions where the first place gets like 0.9997 and the second place gets 0.9996, something like that. So here, actually, the problem was quite challenging, and it was hard to get like a very high score. So the first place is 0.631, quite significant difference from the second place, and second and third were actually tied. And our score was 0.541, which was good enough to be in the top 2%. Okay, here's the first place solution. So basically, they use the UNet, but the thing about the UNet is that you don't really, like, you can use any convolutional neural network without the dense layers for UNet. So basically, they created a very, very big UNet. So they took a bunch of deep networks such as ResNet and DenseNet, and those numbers correspond to the number of layers in those networks, like ResNet 152, for example. Pre-trained on ImageNet for the encoder for the left part, and then they created the corresponding right part structure. And this is how they won two Kaggle competitions, actually. Before that, they did that for the Carvana challenge about it like 8 months ago. It was not exactly the same team, but there were like some of the guys were the same, and they used the same kind of model. And those guys are like real pros, like Kaggle grandmasters. So they use like lots of heavy augmentation, many external data sets, heavy light GBM post-processing for nuclei separation based on like all of those parameters, and lots of ensembling for different network architectures. And they actually predicted borders between cells as a separate class. So that was an interesting approach. So basically, like, they didn't just like peel one pixel from the border as we did, but they actually put it into a separate class and they predicted it. And then what they found out when first they took all of the pixels and predicted, and then it turned out that their model predicted the pixels really well when it was not close to the other nuclei, and really poorly when it was on the actual border. So they just took the borders between overlapping nuclei, and that gave them a better score. And they also used a combination of, they didn't just use a simple loss function, they used a combination of binary cross entropy and soft dice, because there was some reasoning behind that gave them a better score again. So, any question?
Do you know what that loss function is, soft dice loss?
Not exactly. I mean, it's a standard loss function, but it's less common than binary cross entropy.
It gives you a formula that is somewhat similar to intersection over union, not exactly, and it's a continuous function. And it doesn't have. It's not like intersection over union in this case. So out of the ready loss functions, it's the loss function that approximates intersection over union the closest that I have found. But it gives you that for the whole image, not for mask by mask. So it was not directly applicable in this competition.
Another question there?
Yep. Do you have any idea what human level performance would be? Like how far off perfect is 0.63?
Human level performance, I would think it would be a lot worse, because basically it's pretty hard. Like even between people who are, like if you take two different people to manually mark all of those images, for some of them it's pretty hard to tell how they would be marked. I mean, maybe it wouldn't be like a ton worse, but it would be, I think it would be worse. Like it wouldn't take first place if you were to manually predict all of those images, I think. But we haven't tried, so yeah, I don't know.
I have another question. I've seen it now on the leaderboard again. So many Kaggle competitions have these ODS to ODI people.
Yes.
Who are they?
That's a secret Russian community. Well, it's not so secret. You can go to ods.ai, and it's
There's
Russian.
only one input, like in Russian writing.
It's like Open Data Science.ai Russian Slack channel. So anyone can join, but if you don't speak Russian, you probably won't benefit greatly from it. Unless maybe you want to post some jobs there, I don't know, like because they do speak English, but yeah, most of the information there is in Russian.
Right. I have a question about the external data sets. I saw there's a thread on a discussion on the Kaggle site there where some of the contestants were finding data errors, and they were building external data sets with the fixes for the errors. So the external data sets you're referring to, are those what those are? Or do you have to use the original data set that may have errors in it?
Okay, so in this competition, you could use anything you wanted. There was no rule that you had to just use the data set that was provided. There were some errors, and we actually used the data set that we used was one of those fixes. But when I talk about like, let's say the first place solution, the external data sets that they used were not just the fixes of the original data set. They actually got some other data sets from other sources that were labeled somehow, I'm assuming. I doubt that they labeled them themselves, so I guess there were some other data sets available.
Do you know if there's any feedback from the organizers of the competition, whether the accuracy of these results helped them to solve the original problem, which is in their workflow to be able to have a mask that accurately identifies the cells so they can pass it on to their next step?
Well, I mean, overall, I mean, most of the time the organizers were just dealing with this issue of like lots of people complaining because they got ejected from the leaderboard. So most of the feedback from the organizers was about that. But yeah, but I think they were probably pretty happy with the results because like before the competition ended, they actually predicted that probably they're like in the middle of the competition, they expected the results to be lower than they actually were. So I would assume they're probably pretty happy. Yes.
That's working. Okay. So the first place solution looks like they made an architecture on the encoder part where they were able to use ImageNet weights and then basically use a kind of a pseudo pre-trained network. So I'm wondering, is that one of the, like, and I'm assuming now that when they trained their models, it would probably run a lot faster, so they could do a lot more iterations and experiment a lot more things. So how long did it take you guys to run those 200 epochs per iteration of running that model? And do you think that's one of your regrets? It's not being able to use a pre-trained model and then being able to iterate through it faster so you can learn more over and over?
I mean, it's sort of a regret, but I mean, not so much in the way that it's not that you just use the pre-trained model, you need to figure out how to use it. And we didn't have this idea of inserting I mean, we probably didn't have time for that anyway because we were doing everything in a month because you would have to figure out how to construct the right side of that UNet. I mean, these guys, since they're doing it in multiple competitions, they probably have a function that does that automatically. You just feed it a neural network like a ResNet and it creates the right side of the UNet.
Out of curiosity, sorry, how long did it take you to run?
How long? A few hours.
On the GPU, okay.
Yeah, on the GPU, like a few hours, like maybe 4 or 5 hours. I mean, it depends. We made some changes, but in general, yeah, in this range.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Yes?
Were there any non-neural nets solutions?
Not in the top, like 1,000 probably. Yeah, like some people probably use them, like who were just learning how to use Kaggle, but yeah, I mean, you couldn't get a high result with that. All right, so the third place solution was just Mask RCNN, and Matterport is the company that basically created like a kernel for that. So basically we just download this model from their site. But it was not as simple as just downloading it and just running the training and just getting a third place in this competition. Because the RCNNs, they're very complex models, and if you don't do it very carefully, it's very easy to overfit them. So basically you need, like they used here, the only thing that they used is a lot of scale and augmentation and test time augmentation, because the data set was pretty small, so not to overfit, they augmented it heavily. And actually, I say they, but I think it's one guy. This guy here really tuned the parameters of this network to get a good performance and got a third place, actually tied for second and third. Okay, the fourth place solution, Bruce, you're sure you were not on the fourth place team because you asked about the double UNet. The second stage of the double UNet was used for deep watershed. So there is this watershed algorithm. It actually has a deep analog. There are some papers on deep watershed, and apparently they use this double UNet for this kind of approach. And they also used external data sets and synthetic data. I'm not sure how they generated the synthetic data, but it's interesting. I guess not many teams use this kind of an approach because, I mean, it's not clear how to generate it so that it's actually useful. And also they use test time augmentation by flips and rotations. And then when they predicted on each of those flips and rotations, and then they compared the predictions, and they removed predictions with small overlap as false positives. That probably is one thing that we could have done that we wish we did, because it's a good idea, because we were thinking about, like, we also did a little bit of that. I'm not sure if it was in the final model or not, but basically, when you just try to sum the probabilities, it doesn't really help you much. But what they did, they actually like flipped and rotated those images, and they looked at the shape and saw whether there was a really good overlap. So, and only in those cases they kept them, and otherwise they just threw them out as false positives. So this was definitely a good thing to do. And the fifth place solution, it's also a MassCar CNN. They use the pre-trained ResNet, like ResNet 101 with first 50 layers initialized from a pre-trained network. And they also use external data set for training and heavy image augmentation and mosaics to predict the borders better, and stratified training and validation sets. And they did the same thing as the fourth place team, test time augmentation by flipping and remove predictions with small overlap as false positives. So yeah, this was a good technique to use. All right, thank you everyone. Are there any more questions?
Okay, round of applause. I have a question for you guys. So I know that you guys are both relatively new to kind of this group, like in terms of the last year. And is this like your first serious competition that you both entered? And what kind of background did you have when you entered this? Like, did you have to learn all about deep learning and stuff when you started?
Well, I knew a little bit about deep learning, but it was my first serious Kaggle competition, like probably like my second Kaggle competition after Titanic. So yeah, but I've been studying deep learning for the last 4 or 5 months. So I mean machine learning in general, but deep learning as part of it. So I sort of had a general idea, I guess, and now I have a much better idea after this competition.
Very similar for me. Also my first serious competition, and I started, I have been interested in data science for a while, but have not done something of significant size, anything comparable to this before.
So just because there's probably a few people here that are maybe admiring your effort, or I'm not sure they're inspired by it. So what resources did you use to kind of learn all about this stuff? I'm curious myself. Start with Stan, or start with Stan.
Doesn't matter. Okay. Well, I mean, there are a lot of free or very cheap online resources now, like all kinds of courses, like Coursera and such. And I mean, in general, I find that just reading the papers is very useful. So I mean, probably if you know nothing about machine learning, you should start with something like Andrew Ng's course on Coursera or something. Or there is like Fast AI, so all of those courses are pretty good. But once you, like, especially if you have some sort of academic background, I think it actually helps to read a lot of papers and just try to understand the ideas in those papers. Because a lot of, basically a lot of online courses, they sort of assume that you don't really know much about machine learning. So once you get to a certain level, it's actually, I find it more helpful to actually just read research papers and get information from that.
For me, I found the Fast AI course very helpful. I'm from a software engineering background, so I find it very helpful because it has a very practical focus. We also used a lot of time. This competition between the two of us, hundreds of hours of work. But it was worth it, in my opinion. I learned a lot from this competition. I experimented with a lot of things that I don't think I would have been, would have had a chance to do without something like this to put this effort in.
Any other specific questions about that? Okay. Okay, so we'll just wrap things up here. Am I echoing? No. Just wrap things up here before we go and get something to eat. So at the end of these meetings, we always talk about presentations to come 2 weeks and a month from now. We have a presenter that's volunteered for 2 weeks from now. It's Matt Emery. He's a regular here. He's been coming here for at least over a year, so that's a lot of experience that he'll bring to the presentation. It'll probably be a really good one. So I encourage everybody to come to that. Another thing I'd like to talk about is, since there's so many people here interested in machine learning, interested in learning this stuff, Kaggle is such a great resource. I try to give people an opportunity to kind of form teams amongst the group to work on a learning competition, or to be like these guys and try to team up and do a really challenging competition. So I've tried this a variety of ways. So I'm gonna say, everybody that's interested in kind of forming a team with somebody, just go to the back right corner away from me and share some contact information if that's interesting to you. And then finally, there were a few people here that were hiring. Maybe if you announced and you were hiring, could you just stand up now so people can like identify you and seek you out right afterwards? And then there's also, although I don't want to encourage people applying for this one because Dennis is here. There's also this company. You may as well apply for both of them. Healthy company. So there's I guess 3 opportunities for people that are looking for work. So hopefully that helps you out. So I guess we'll wrap things up. Let's give another round of applause to these two for doing such an amazing job. And if you're interested in coming to eat, we're going to Rogue. It's just a waterfront, but we'll all be leaving here as a group, the people that are interested. So if you are interested in coming to eat, just hang around and we'll leave in 5 minutes or so once we tidy up. Oh, one more comment, sorry. Or you can use both.
So one thing I also learned from this competition is that you always hear that you really need to have a really good GPU to learn about deep learning and to get any experience with deep learning. For most of the time in this competition, we were just using CPUs for training. It needs a lot of patience. Training can take days, but we found some ways around that. Things like we would let the network calculate the output every few epochs or every epoch so that we know early on if the training is going well or not. Also, we spent a lot of time early on in the competition writing code and exploring ideas in other ways, and also writing post-processing code, which does not need retraining. So it is possible to learn data science without a GPU. However, we really needed a GPU in the end. Once we saw that the solution is doing well and we needed to experiment with a lot more ideas, having a GPU enabled us to be a lot more efficient. We borrowed a GPU from Matt, thanks Matt again. And we also rented a GPU online, and this helped us achieve a higher score.
Renting a GPU. Yeah, and then we'll.
Yeah. So, what did you use Paperspace to rent?
I used Paperspace.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Paperspace has the ability to rent GPU time, so and it's pretty cheap, apparently.
And there are other places to rent GPUs. You can rent GPUs on Azure.
Oh, right.
Yeah, all of those big, Google Cloud, AWS, and usually when you join, they give you some free credits, like maybe even $300 of credits. So for a while you can use that. Although you'll need to figure out how to set it up there.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody.